Good Sunday morning, everyone. I hope you had a good Thanksgiving. I know we did here. It was good. And boy, we've got a lot of changes coming up this month. And I actually think it's for the positive, because this is the December forecast that I wanted to kind of give. And it's an interesting time right now because we've got Mercury literally has just stationed yesterday morning, and it's eking through the sky. It's such an interesting thing to follow the astronomy because it really, truly is astronomy. I always mention this is a pretty interesting couple of books here. You can't get these anymore, but this is called The Books of Astronomy by Guido Bonatti, written in the 1100s. Of course, they refer to that as the 12th century. And very interesting because he called it astronomy, and a lot of the ancient astrologers called it that. And again, we have the language barrier with the Vedic stuff, but they too look at it as astronomy. And there's so many good people I've worked with in Vedic astrology, as well as in the Western track. They call it that. Well, why am I bringing this up? Because Saturn just went direct too. But Mercury and Saturn are so much different in speeds, and that's simply because of the orbits around the Earth. And of course, the distances that they are from the sun and the earth. So just to give you an idea, right now, Mercury is sitting here at 11 seconds today, and it's slowly increasing. By the end of January, it's going to be doing 1 degree 46 minutes. Now, to put that in perspective, that's like 100 times faster than it is right now. And again, this is all just looking at perspectives. If you've ever heard of vectors in physics, they talk a lot about vectors. And that's really what this is. I don't care if you want to use the analogy of a car or two airplanes, or any 2 points that you're referencing that are both moving. Of course, the vectors are the forces on them, and also, of course, how fast or slow they are in relationship to one another. So it's very complex. But just to give you an idea, right now, between now and the next few days, we've got Mercury trining both Jupiter and Saturn. So what does this mean in plain English? Because this is all heady, astrology and terms and so on and so forth. This is a really productive time, in my opinion. Even though we're going to see certain crazy things go on in the world, it's actually an intellectual time right now of growth. And, if you take this out to 100,000 feet and you say, okay, well, what's really the energy going on in December? I would say this overall is a productive, creative time. Why? We've also got, you can't just take anything in one, because the Mercury trine Jupiter and Saturn, that's going to be over with next week, right? So it happens very quick. And again, there's nothing wrong with utilizing this energy. But here's the point. We've overall got Mars and the sun and Venus and the sun coming together. And of course, this will perfect in January, but there's something astrologers call orbs of influence. It's like, did you ever get out of the car at a concert and notice you hear the warm-up band or the band playing, right? Way before you get in there. So we're influenced by these energies as they get closer and closer and closer together. And that's kind of like light and sound is a really good analogy. And this is what's happening. So overall, this is a productive, creative time. Now, some people may not experience that depending on how you've got other aspects in your chart. But in general, this is a time of action and moving forward. Even though, and I got to mention this, we are going to have the winter solstice right on the 21st of this month. And you might say, well, I should say December coming up, this meaning that month. So that happens every single year. This is nothing new, right? But the energies always tend to get a little slower. This is a time where you want to rest a little bit more, take care of your health, so on and so forth. Now, the people who might be listening down under, because I have a lot of clients who are in Southeast Asia, Australia, New Zealand, South America, they're down under. They're underneath the equator. This is exactly the opposite for them. They're going to the summer solstice. So the energy's peaking, right? The weather's going to get real hot after that. So it's really interesting when you look at astronomy versus location. It's so, so important. That's why I love location astrology. I always mention it in readings because, boy, it depends on where you are. Let me tell you, at the energies you receive. So again, to all of us in the Northern Hemisphere, we're heading to the winter solstice on the 21st of December. This is a time that's really good to like cleanse for parasites. I also often like to reflexology. You can increase that a little bit more. Or, if you're going to a doctor for any particular things, go, get things looked at. It's a time to take it a little more easy. Of course, those you down under, it's going to go to a peak, right? So we're often really pushing the envelope down there. And just like we will be in June 21st this upcoming year. So these cycles never, ever stop. But what is important is the energies that are going on right now for each of us and collectively. This is actually a pretty creative and productive time. I don't know if anyone feels that, but Mercury's now direct and making good aspects. And, I got to tell you, I've been studying a lot of very interesting stuff with ancient astrologers, both in the East and in the West. And there's a diagram. Let me see if I've got it here. Yeah, I'll bring it in here. This is kind of a heady diagram, but pretty doggone interesting, because what it is it's showing, and this is from the 12th century, and this is the orbits and juxtapositions of the planets. I actually took this out of a book which is called Leopold of Austria. And it's a translation that's actually been done a couple of times. But what's important about it, and I love this. Let me see if I can get this thing turned off here. There we go. This is actually the book. It was just translated by Benjamin Dykes. He's a PhD out of Minnesota. Done a lot of good translations. I'll give him credit for that. And but this was actually done earlier by Francis James Carmody. And I don't know if anybody's familiar with these, but a lot of these university professors had gone in and translated stuff out of Sanskrit, out of Latin, out of Greek, out of Coptic, Egyptian, really interesting stuff. And this was actually originally, Carmody had translated this particular work. And the farther back I go into many of these different translations, I always say, I think the air was cleaner and the food was better, right? They weren't spraying us with chemtrails and heavy metals and barium, because I can tell you, these people were smart. And when you read these texts, you go, wow, they had valued the art of astrology and looked at it so much in society. Things with health, things with, the kings would ask questions. So would the generals, and of course, the general populace. There's so many interesting historical documents that show this was actually an integrated way of life. I always mention, again, Benjamin Franklin, which, he was the creator of the original Farmer's Almanac, which actually was called Poor Richard's Almanac. You can see that right there. This is Benjamin Franklin back in the 1700s, early 1700s. So this is really interesting stuff, how all of this, has been kind of, alongside of society's development. And I find today more people are interested in astronomy, astrology than I've ever seen before. Because, we got the internet, you can jump on, you can find out anything about anything, or go to ChatGPT or Google, and you can Google a term and it'll immediately come up for you in AI. I find it actually interesting. And I have to tell you, knowledge is expanding. And overall, December, I would say, is a time it's really good to be creative or set a lot of goals this particular month, because in general, we've also got Saturn sextiling Uranus. So it's overall not a bad time. It really isn't. Now, we're going to see craziness in the world. Remember, if we really take it up to a couple 100,000 feet and look down, we've still got Uranus going back over the Pleiades, and it's going to hit Alcyon this spring. And of course, what are we seeing? I'm seeing riots in Germany, trouble in London, trouble in the UK. Also hearing the same thing in Australia. A lot of people are telling me the borders are just getting flooded. And remember, here in the United States, we're also going to see all this money kick in from that one big, beautiful bill. And guess what's going to happen? There are people lined up around the block who want to become ICE agents. And then we've got the empire striking back through the media, the talk show hosts and everything else, combating this, literally saying, oh, this is evil to enforce the laws we've had on the books. So I won't get into the politics of all that, but we are going to see a clashing here of the Titans. And this is a very interesting time. And again, that parallels the Neptune Saturn conjunction in February. So even though we're talking about the month of December, you got to look at the big picture, because there's never one thing influencing us. And this is really powerful energy right now. And again, I've mentioned the age of disclosure. And I got to say, Chris Bledsoe is getting back to me. We're going to try and do a show here in the next week or so. We're going to pre-record it, and I'm going to broadcast it, because if anyone's not familiar with Chris Bledsoe, he wrote the UFO of God book, and he's a good friend of mine, and I like him a lot. And he also has actually been speaking to people in the government, in the military, and various other places about some of the phenomena he has had with craft visiting him. I was actually with Chris last summer in Contact in the Desert, and we actually saw a bunch of craft that was pretty well. So deep stuff. And again, this is the whole realm of, are we alone, right? And many people, I've met people from the 1800s when I was a kid who were quite old at the time, and they were telling me of the stuff that they saw. I had an uncle who actually ran a steam engine up in Alaska in the late 1800s, early 1900s. He was telling me all kinds of stuff that he used to see. My grandmother, 1907, she was born, telling me, seeing fireballs rolling through the fields in the house, crazy stuff. So we are definitely, I think, about to see some very powerful things disclosed and coming out. This is an interesting time to be alive. And I think, again, the most important thing we have on top of all the astrology and everything else is one thing that sits right between your ears, and that's called your mind. And, I used to work with an old guy. He used to say, use your head for something besides a hat rack. And I thought that was a cute little expression. But what that means is analyze yourself. Use a self-introspection, self-analysis. And again, as we move to the winter solstice, this is a time in the Northern Hemisphere to do that, to reflect on it's the last Gregorian calendar month of the year. Now, I say that because in the ancient times, they didn't treat this as the end of the year. They actually said the end of the year was the Saturn period, which happens right before the spring equinox. And in my opinion, I think that's the better calendar, but we don't use that. We're all stuck on the Gregorian calendar, right? But they actually treated the spring equinox as the beginning of the year. And that also very closely aligns to the first moon closest to the spring equinox, which many people in religions might recognize as the Passover. How about that? A lot of secrets to that one. And that, to me, energetically is more accurate, but I think there's a psychic power to societies, locked into the Gregorian calendar. There's no question everybody treats the first of the year. Look at the celebrations we get. January 1st, right? Oh, setting new goals, setting everything. And isn't that interesting? That happens right after the winter solstice. So the sun is on its rise back up the arc to the peak of the summer solstice. So there's some merit also to the Gregorian calendar. And of course, it's all we know, right? Anybody born in the last few hundred years would say, okay, it's a Gregorian calendar, because I forget when it was changed, but somebody might know that in detail. But I know I deal a lot with older charts cast in the 1600s, 1500s, and all the way back. And they're on the Julian calendar or some other type of calendar. So it's pretty interesting stuff. And again, it's all a matter of perspective. We're all literally looking out at life through our perception of reality. And that's a good thing to take accounting of as we head to the winter solstice. Reevaluation. Every year, everybody sets their New Year's goals, right? They set, well, this is the precursor to that, December. Why? Because December is heading towards the winter solstice, which is the lowest point. The sun appears to stand in the sky for about 3 days, and then starts to rise again. See, that's where the sun dies on the cross, if you will. So interesting stuff to that. So anyways, again, we've got this Sun-Mars conjunction, which could bring more violence. And on a personal level, it can, and by the way, that Sun-Mars conjunction actually happens on January 8th. And we have the Sun-Venus conjunction happening January 6th. So this is a powerful new year coming up. There's no question about that. And of course, these are the holiday seasons. A lot of people get depressed during that time. A lot of times people feel lonely. They say suicides are much higher during the holiday season than they are often at other times. And that's because in the Northern Hemisphere, the ebb of energy is getting lower as we go to the winter solstice. So it's really important to stay positive, keep focused, stay in a place of gratitude is probably another good message to convey. And also watch your thoughts. With all the astrology and all the stuff and its accuracy, there's still one thing that's superior, and that is creation and consciousness. And I always emphasize that because as much as I like the study of astrology and all that, I really love paranormal phenomena and also spiritual research. And when we look really at it all, and this is something that's not focused on nearly enough, is your mind. Your mind, your inner consciousness is really the power of creation. And we all have it within us. Every one of us do. And you can see it in animals, you can see it in human beings. It's the will to survive, it's the will to focus and create, and most importantly, the elements of desire. And that is so important because, we can get lost. Like I just had a conversation this morning with an individual who was having some very challenging health things right before the podcast. And I encouraged this person. I said, you got to stay positive because the chart shows these incredibly powerful, difficult aspects are separating. They're going away. And this person also has Saturn and Neptune right over their ascendant. And I've been mentioning this, this is where astrology used in the right light or in the right perspective, it's all vectors and energy. And I said, keep your mind positive. I said, because this will pass. And sometimes we can really feel hopeless. A lot of people will sometimes feel like, oh my God, this is just going to get worse. It's never going to get better. They could be in legal troubles. They could be in health issues, which are the worst in my opinion, or other issues, could be relationships, whatever. And what I like about looking at your cycles is it gives you a map. It's kind of like a person who was traveling across a particular land and you had a map that told you what the weather was like, and it told you how far and how high the hills were and up and down, right? Today, we all travel in cars and planes and, some air-conditioned heated vehicle. And we're not quite as in touch with the environment. But then again, look at the accidents we see when these bad snowstorms come in, or, the challenges that can happen on the road. So again, it's all up to us because we're the driver, so to speak, of our lives. And it's really important to keep positive and keep focused because, the will inside of us all is the magic that keeps us moving forward. And when we lose that, I don't care what the transits or progressions are, that is the most important thing. Most good healers and doctors will tell you the main thing that seems to generate very powerful, endorphins, or you could say hormones, particularly in the body, and they're released through the glands, is attitude, your emotions. And this is why all your self-help, thinkers and personal motivational speakers will work on that. They get you fired up, right? If you ever go to a corporate meeting, a sales meeting, or you go to, some religious event, what's it all about? Emotion, right? Get them fired up. Political events. We see this all the time. You got to do that to yourself sometimes. Got to look in the mirror a little bit and say, hey, give yourself a little whack and say, let's focus on what we want and stay positive. Because if you do, that is the magic that keeps us going. And it really is. That's the magic of life. In Vedic astrology, they actually call that Jiva. And it's an interesting thing that Jupiter is connected to that. Jupiter is always the life-giving force that modulates the energies coming through the sun. And they look at astrology completely different. A good friend of mine who passed away was Chakrapani. Chakrapani is probably the guy who coined the phrase Vedic astrology. He came here in the 60s. He passed away in his late 80s. And a nice guy, just a sweetheart. And he came from India, and he lived in Santa Monica, and we'd go out to dinner now and then. And what was interesting is he said, I knew Americans would never understand the word Jyotisha. And he said, so we called it Vedic astrology, and it really stuck. And it's interesting to speak to many different spiritual and astrological practitioners because we all have a different take on everything. But it all comes down to one thing, and that is our perception of reality and how we assimilate and put this stuff where we keep going. You keep finding a way out. That's if you look at many of the great thinkers. It was Carl Jung is another one I really like. He again broke off from Freud, and he began to really study astrology like very deeply. And he's written a lot of great stuff, and he talked about synchronicity. And that was a great book. In fact, Police wrote a song about that, Synchronicity, a whole album, right? So bottom line is synchronicity, I like to extrapolate to resonance of thoughts. You see, what you think about emits out of the third eye chakra. It's very, very important. Let me see if I can fire up my screen share here. And, this relates to astrology in a very interesting way. And let me see if I can get this thing to go. There we go. So, it didn't go here. There it is. Yeah, it's finally going. So one of the things the Vedic astrologers referred to was planets were actually called graha in Sanskrit and Tamil. What does graha mean? Actually means Caesar or grasper of the aura. I always say forget Trinity, Neo, and Morpheus, even though it was a great movie or series of movies. It's really a matrix that we're in here. And again, this is the plate out of the Bhagavad Gita that shows the life force energy leaving death to rebirth. That's this white etheric energy, which is outside of the physical realm, which is the soul, spirit, and psyche, which interestingly enough is believed by the ancients to come down through the stars. Very deep, deep, deep stuff. And again, when you look at us on a microcosmic model, you can see you have the tree of life within you. All these planets are within you. You are a resonant, you could say, being with the celestial influences, which are constantly being modulated. Constantly. So this is deep, deep stuff. And again, one of my favorite diagrams that I always show, and I love this diagram, and I could explode this so many more times, but that is the divinity or the divine energy coming down into creation. And the souls are believed to be created up here. This, again, big red thick line, the dashed line, is where creation in the physical world start. In other words, this is where the scientists are all saying, everything is energy, everything's molecules, atoms, and neutrinos, and amino acids, and all these building blocks of life, which are quite profound. And you look at genetics, and you think about that. Again, I mentioned the mother creates a garment in the womb for the physical genetic experience of life. And that is deep, deep stuff when you think about it. I mean, nobody can fathom and I remember, I think one of them, Watson or Crick, I think died a while back, but there was a celebration just recently about him, Watson and Sir Francis Crick, who discovered the genetic codes. And they were saying, we'll be lucky in 1,000 years if we figure out exactly what we did, because we're literally taking energy and putting into some genetic order, which is very mysterious stuff. And the celestial influences influence the life as we go through it. And it's quite fascinating how many of these ancient astrologers would actually show, and you can see it, when you're likely to run into trouble, which could mean exit of the body, we call death. And, all of us are going to definitely not live forever, not in the body, that's for sure. So interesting stuff, because again, the mind is probably the most important thing, because the mind is what assimilates all of these experiences that we have. And if I zoom in here, I always mention here, the lower conscious mind in Vedic astrology was referred to as the positions of the moon and the influences upon it. And what's interesting is the moon is not only the womb of the mother, but it's also the lower, you could say, bottom end of your conscious mind. You could actually divide the conscious mind maybe into two fragments. One is the spirit part of the conscious mind, and the lower one is our emotional perception of reality, which is eerily shown by the astrology. And in fact, the Vedic astrologers would talk a lot about the manas or traits of the mind. And boy, they weren't wrong. Notice Saturn is right up above the so-called division of the subconscious conscious mind. See, this is more the major division between what psychology might refer to as our deep hidden subconscious elements and then the lower constructs of the conscious mind, which I kind of think is more accurately divided into two sections, the spirit and the lower emotional response patterns of the mind. So it's really deep stuff. And where does this all fit into with December's forecast? Well, again, as we head in the northern hemisphere to the, again, winter solstice here, of course, for you down under, it's heading towards the summer solstice. It's a time to really reflect and also rework. And again, even if you're in the southern hemisphere, you're still going to get the stuff I was talking about earlier. Mercury and Saturn are now trining each other, and they're both direct. What does that mean? Mercury's logic and thinking, and Saturn is structure. So it's a good time right now to reassimilate, rethink, and come up with new plans and new directions. We see this in the political world right now. A lot of stuff happening right now in the United States here with the Trump administration and all the politics going on. And boy, the fur's hitting the fan here on both sides of the fence. So, and we're seeing this in Europe. We're seeing this in other places I'm hearing about. So a lot of political turmoil. And that's the big picture with Uranus going over the Pleiades. Always brings major changes in the world. And that's going to be going on for quite a while, because not only does Uranus go direct and go back over Alcyon in May, it's also going to keep eking forward. Nothing ever stops. Nothing ever stops. It always keeps going. So we get some really powerful energies here coming in. And I got to tell you, when you look at the astronomy, it's absolutely fascinating to me. Like right now, Saturn is doing literally 17 seconds a day, but it only speeds up to 2 degree minutes per day. Now, for anyone not familiar, what that means is they measure the speeds of planets in how many degrees, minutes, and seconds it goes in a day. And remember, there's 360 degrees to a circle. So this is all just geometry, and it's just fancy ways astrologers explain it. But when you look at the speeds of Mercury, Mercury gets flying. Mercury will hit its top speed right in January. It'll actually be just under 2 degrees. It's about 1 3/4 degrees per day of travel. Right now it's doing 11 seconds. So, and remember, there's 60 seconds per minute. There's 60 minutes per degree. So that kind of gives you an idea of how to wrap your mind around that. So the speed variances in these planets is huge. And with Mercury and Saturn both just literally hanging in the sky, Mercury will speed up very quick. It's because it goes so much faster than Saturn. Saturn, you'd be lucky if it hits maybe 7 minutes a day at its top speed. See, and then Saturn will turn around and go retrograde again at the end of July. So this never, ever stops. We are in a matrix of constant intermixing of speeds, vectors, and planets and energies that are mixing throughout the world as it ekes through time. And you got to remember, we also have the precessions of the astrology. This is the 25,000, some people say it's 700 years, some people say it's 900 years through the great, what they call galactic year. So this is deep, deep stuff. And of course, this is the galactic center. It's going to be very hard to see this, but some of you can zoom in on your phones or what have you. But this is deep stuff. And again, when we look at the real outer juxtaposition of our solar system in the rest of the fixed stars or constellations, deep stuff, deep stuff. And I got to tell you, it's really fascinating to read some of these ancient texts because they really reflect on a lot of great knowledge. We think about, they were just, ancient crazy people. No, they weren't. And they knew about the elliptical patterns of the moon and so many different things that were so fascinating. I really enjoy studying some of these old texts. It's absolutely phenomenal how they knew astrology would affect and interact. And that's the key with our consciousness, whether you believe it or not. It's an interactive consciousness, which means, do we have free will? In fact, I'm doing a talk here next, I think, Wednesday on a show from, I think, this person, I'll put up the show, but on my website, but because I just get asked to do these shows and I do them. But what's fascinating is one of the questions is do we have free will? And my answer is absolutely we do. We always have the ability of reaction, which again focuses on consciousness. So I think looking at astrology is predicting the future, though it seems to, and it certainly influences the future greatly, it's also incumbent upon us, and this is what the religions were right about, to stay in a focused, conscious place. We can all have fun and do what we do, but ultimately it comes down to your mind and how you assimilate these energies and react to them. And what I find is when you understand these cycles of astrologies, and there's very complex, but when you assimilate that and you get the general terrain of where your life is at through the cycles of life, and we all have them, you tend to operate more intelligently. It's just like a driver who's got his window, all frosted up. You're not going to see what's coming at you. You see? That's like blinded. But when you clear off the window, or the other analogy is you assimilate what you're getting out of a reading or the energies that are upon you, if you study your own astrology, you begin to make more sense of it. And it takes time to really understand that. Again, I've had the blessing of studying this stuff for just 50 years now. It's actually be 51. When I first got exposed to it, I didn't know much back then. It takes years. And the more I get to know, the more I realize that I don't know. I'll be lucky if I live 5 lifetimes to ever fully understand, or even come close to fully understanding how complex this stuff is. And nobody drawing breath. If you talk to 100 different astrologers, you're going to get 100 different slightly varied viewpoints, because they use certain techniques. They're going to use certain things, books that they've read, what they've exposed to, what they see works, and I study constantly. And I find books I pick up that I've read 30, 40 years ago, 45 years ago. And I'm seeing my notes and going, oh my God, I forgot about that. So it's really a science of the soul. And that's exactly what Vedic astrology means. It's the Jyotisha means the science of the light of the soul. And a lot of people have asked me, they've said, what is more accurate, the tropical systems or the sidereal? And interestingly enough, I say both. And I get a lot of heat from that, from different camps of astrology, because the critics of tropical astrology say, well, yeah, but they're not using the real signs. Well, yes, they are, in a sense. The lower, densest layer is to the earth. And then they say, well, but they're not using the lunar mansions. Well, the Egyptians did. They used 28 of them. And I've met a lot of the old guys out of India who used the 28 lunar mansions, not the 27. So this gets really complex and it gets really confusing. But I like to look at all this stuff and take it in and just let it wash over me and understand just how smart some of these people were. And particularly Egypt, Chaldea, Mesopotamia, and Greece, all intermixed back at some very ancient time with the scholars in India as well. And there's a lot of evidence to that. One of the oldest texts that they know about in interrogation astrology was Yavanjataka. That was actually translated by David Pingree in the late 50s, early 60s. He was a professor at Harvard, a pretty amazing guy too, I might add that. And he did some profound translations. And there's a lot of people out there doing that. Dyke's work is, I have great respect for it. He's done a great job. Anyways, long story short, what it proves to us is that this isn't just, somebody discovering where the stars were. They knew intimately how complex, and they had techniques that were far more advanced than just somebody, we just figured out that the moon trines, or whatever. They were very advanced. I think there is lore that it goes back to Petrosiris. I had Rosie Cutter on just recently. She was in Egypt when we were talking about this. Petrosiris, there's also Nesepsho, and many other kings that are alluded to that could be back 600, 700, 1,000, 1,500 years BC. The same thing we find in India. So this science, kind of like what we're talking about with this whole UFO disclosure thing, is there's very advanced knowledge that has been on this planet, I think, since the beginning of human existence. And it just ebbs and flows and gets lost in destructions in the war, kind of like the Tartarian stuff. So it's really, really fun and deep stuff. And what's, I think, most useful about this is it gives us a perspective on our lives, the cycles of our lives, and you run into some really tough stuff sometimes, like little babies that die early, that, really saddening. Or you'll run into people who have really traumatic events with, various different genetic things, disorders, being born a certain way. And you look at the astrology and it mirrors it, and it's wild. And you also see people who are exceedingly successful, and you see it mirrored in the astrology. One of the most controversial figures of this era is Donald Trump. And again, his chart is amazingly powerful. And what's interesting is how his Mars in the ascendant gives him a militaristic like way to push through, and it also creates the backlash. Very interesting stuff. Donald Trump was born with a Kalasarpa yoga, broken by the moon by 30 minutes of arc. And that doesn't mean time, that means degree minutes. And this is why he's such a powerful, controversial figure. But my take is, we are going to see his actions in this country create transformations we have never seen before. And the empire is going to strike back, and they're going to do what they're going to do. And I don't want to get into politics, and I'll get hate mail if I say anything good about Trump, right? But my personal opinion is, looking at the astrology when he was inaugurated and what's going on with this country, we are going to actually see a very good and powerful future. And that's one of the things I looked at too. The Egyptians and the ancient Vedas gave us some very interesting stuff. They would often cast charts right before reading, not to read the person's mind, but to get a deeper understanding of what might be in the heart of the individual. This is interesting stuff. And this gets into a little psychic work. There's actually a book put out by Herman of Carinthia. It was I think this was written in the 8th century, and somewhere right around there. And it was looking into how the ancient Egyptians, Mesopotamians, and Chaldeans, as well as Vedic astrologers, would cast charts for the moment to see how they could better help the client. Well, I've been doing that now with this podcast, and I did that today, and I'm going to start doing that in the future. This is really cool stuff, because when I did an interrogation on this podcast, like what would be the best thing to discuss today? And you know what it said? It actually says it's really good to focus on personal goals this month. And it also says it's really good to turn a little bit away from the unpleasantnesses that are going on in the world. On the other hand, it's also good to look at them from the standpoint of what can you do personally to better yourself out of it. But I can tell you, one of the other things it says is that it's focus on your health, or stay positive mentally, and set goals. That's what it shows. So again, Mercury's direct, Saturn's direct. Now it's time to whatever it is that you're doing in your life. It's a great time to focus on getting things done. And that Sun-Mars conjunction with Venus conjoining it. See, there's also going to be a Venus-Mars conjunction. And, you look at all these energies. They only happen every so often they only happen once in a lifetime, actually. The way they happen. You can never repeat time twice. It's literally creation in motion. And what I would say here is that between now and January, is a very transformative and productive time overall. Even though, we're going to hear the news, some maniac will do something, right? They always do. And that stuff's going to keep going on. But in general, if I had to say, what's the 50,000 foot overview, personal time of production and accomplishments. So focus your mind. This is actually a very powerful time in the world. And I'm actually kind of encouraged at what I see, even though it's descensional and transformational. And, that's always a roller coaster ride. But in general, it's powerful. It's a powerful time to be alive. So I'm going to take a look here that a lot of comments here that are coming through that are really good. I'm just looking at the comments now. Someone saying here, I think Trump is here to expose what's hidden under the surface. Let's see the full truth. I got to say, and I don't want to get into politics because I get all kinds of love and hate mail about Trump, but I'm going to tell you something. When he was signed in, that was the most powerful, transformational inauguration of a president I've ever seen. And I went all the way back to George Washington's inauguration. And I've never seen a president yet signed in with the sun right into a conjunction of Pluto. What does that mean? Transformation, change. And my personal opinion is the United States has just gone through a Pluto return. This country is now north of $38 trillion in debt. I mean, if you stop and take a minute, I mentioned this before, that's unfathomable. Again, a billion seconds, you're a little over 40 years old. 2 billion seconds, you're just about 80 years old. A trillion seconds, just to give a perspective on money, right, is 10,000 or is it 11? It's either 10 or 11,700 years. And with that much, it's not much of a difference. You can do the math yourself. You just take 60 times 60. That'll give you, again, the seconds to the minute. And then you got to do that times to the hour. And then to the 24 hours a day, you multiply that times 365, and you'll get an average of how many seconds per year. And then you can figure it out. And that was my math. It was 11,700 years is a trillion seconds. Now, put that into perspective of $38+ trillion in debt. If manufacturing doesn't come back to this country, if resources are not accessed, and I know they have free energy, I think it would disrupt the economy too much. And I think with this disclosure, we might actually see some of that coming out. Let's hope we do. But right now we're not in transitional phase. We're in a phase of destruction if we don't pull out and start reigniting the machinery of the economy here. And it's going to be tough. That's another thing I get. It's going to be a little bit tough here and unpleasant financially. The belt is tight. But I think the long term, it's like turning a ship around. I think by next year, you're going to see things really start to get a lot better. And certain states, maybe not. California is one of them. I mean, they're importing fuel and shutting everything down. They're shutting down the electricity. They're shutting down the refineries and the oil production here. And if that doesn't get reversed, we're going to see insanity. I mean, I know I can drive from California to Arizona and see fuel prices drop $2 a gallon from what I pay here. So there's a little idea of what's going on. So not getting into politics, but we definitely can see the insanity that has been put upon not only the United States, but many other westernized nations. It's as George Bush Sr. said it the best. It's a new one world order, right? Not to get into politics, but that's what they wanted. And this is being reversed. So interesting stuff. So a lot of great stuff here. Someone's saying here, yep, a dollar bill, 6 in a trillion goes from Earth to look, and we are, and be creative. Don't just be a one-way thinker. I don't know, somebody's saying something here about something I'm supposedly not thinking. But anyways, it's hard to grasp all these when I look at them quick. But anyhow, a lot of great comments coming through. A lot of people are responding to this dollars and the economy. Yeah, we are way beyond what's going on. And I'm telling you, that's another thing that shows up. This Sun-Mars conjunction, as well as the Venus, you're going to see, just based on the spring equinox chart of last year, because remember, the new year doesn't really begin astrologically until March approximately 21st, which is the spring equinox. And we're going to see some pretty serious stuff coming down. And don't be surprised if you see things going on. I mean, look, Trump just now canceled all the auto pen stuff. Now that'll be challenged and it'll go to the Supreme Court and all that. But we're going to see things happen here we have never seen in our lifetimes. Most of us drawing breath, if you're 90, you were born in the 30s, right? So most of us drawing breath have probably never seen what we're about to see. And this is going to be quite dramatic. what we saw in 1929, historically, I wasn't around for that. Most of us listening certainly weren't. My grandmother was, and so was my grandfather, and both of them. And I can tell you that was dramatic. I don't think we're going to see anything like that. I think the owners would like to do that, but I see this turning around in a much more positive way overall. Many people, like I mentioned last podcast, are predicting, World War III. I can tell you this situation in Ukraine and Russia. I don't want to say too much on this podcast, but my opinion is there's a lot more undercurrents going on that we're not being told in that war over there. That is very mysterious. I'll just say it that way. There's some very powerful undercurrents that are not being fully communicated. And that's why it's so hard to settle this thing, because the rabbit hole goes real deep on that one. And again, follow the money. And this is a very interesting thing. So I don't want to get too deep into any of these so-called conspiracy theories, right? You know what they say about those? Most of them are true. But anyhow, I will tell you that in general, I think things are turning to a more positive way. And to kind of conclude this podcast, I would say that we personally can utilize this next month in the Northern Hemisphere, at least, as a very productive time. And if you're in the Southern Hemisphere, it's also going to have the same influences. You're just going to the summer solstice. So it's actually still a very productive time. So I like it. So anyways, a lot of great comments here. Again, it's always, it's all about saving the children. Boy, you're hitting pretty close to home there. So someone saying the largest military operation in history. Yeah, there is stuff going on right now that we would be stunned. And I can only say that from some of the people I've been around and talked to who are much more knowledgeable than I am about this stuff. There's, some very deep stuff going on. And I also encourage people to watch the documentary that just came out. You can get it on Netflix. It's called The Age of Disclosure. I was blessed to go to the original screening of it at down in Wilshire Boulevard next to the Theaters Guild. And I was really impressed. Again, this isn't just the CIA. This is so many pilots, so many government people, senators, and people from all over the world in different places saying, look, we are not alone. And they've been lying to us for a good solid 80 to 100 years, and probably longer than that. But very interesting stuff. I think the most interesting thing about this movie is you have professors literally. So you got doctors, professors, CIA, you've got government people, senators, pilots, military people in secret military intelligence areas. I mean, a lot of different, this guy did a great job on that documentary. And what's so profound is this professor said, what's most astounding is not that, there's life out there coming here or life here that's been here. It's the fact that we have been acquiring these craft and reverse engineering them for the last 80 to 100 years, certainly 80, ever since 1947. So interesting stuff. And of course, that's the famous Roswell crash. So the Black Ops stuff is way, way, way deeper. I mentioned this years ago. We've got planes that can cross this country in 10 minutes, 12 minutes. And we've had that a lot longer than they say. If the military tells you anything, I can tell you it's probably 20 or 30 years old. Easy. They've had it a lot longer than they'll ever tell anybody. And you look at the reverse engineering that's been going on with craft. Remember, I had the gentleman on a while back. We talked about the disclosure and some of the craft that he has said was reverse engineered military craft. So interesting. So anyways, a lot of cool stuff. And again, look forward as soon as Chris gets back to me, Chris Bledsoe, who's actually really an amazing guy and has a lot of contact with people, both in the government as well as spiritual people. So he's going to bring some cool stuff on here. So anyways, a lot of people talking about here. We can't even court 1 trillion single digits in 90 years. Oh, that's right. Oh, yeah, you bet. A trillion single digits I get is 11,700 years. And I'd have to recalculate that, but that's what my memory serves me as it is. That's how long a trillion seconds is, which is beyond. Yeah. Yeah. So someone's saying here there will be wars and rumors of wars. Yeah, we're going to see stuff. We always do. But in terms of a global third world war, I'm not seeing that. And I hope I'm right on that. I don't think it's ever going to get to that. Not now. Not with the amount of firepower that is available in secret weaponry. Wars, yes. Wars make money. I wish they didn't, but they do. But so, yeah, and someone's mentioning here Pluto and Aquarius. Again, whether you're a tropical or sidereal astrology, it clearly shows this Saturn, Neptune, and again, Uranus over the Pleiades are the real big ones on the radar screen right now. It's really, really powerful. Yeah, and I think it's going to be epic what's coming up here in terms of what we see disclosed in a number of ways, both with the political scene as well as the other scenes in the, you could say, esoteric world. So a lot of interesting stuff. So anyways, you all have a good week here coming up. And yeah, someone's saying here I could use a new conspiracy theory. Yes. Yeah. You know what they say about rumors, don't you? They're usually true. But anyhow, there might be more truth to that than we know. So someone says, I think Neptune is at the very last degree and is very dangerous. Yeah, that's exactly right. We've got a lot of powerful stuff going up, which is more than I can cover here. When you get into the sidereal systems versus the tropical, they both show that. Yeah, you've got actually the Neptune Saturn conjunction is happening sidereally. In the very first, I forget what degree that is. It's the very first degree. Yeah, I mentioned this before. The very first degree of the Pisces, but it's actually happening at the very first degree of Aries. See, we got a ways to go. That conjunction is not going to happen. No, it's at the very first degree. What am I saying? Yeah, the sidereal conjunction of Neptune and Saturn will be, I think it's somewhere around the 6th or 7th degree. It's right around there. Yeah, I'm actually going forward and looking at that right now. Yeah, it's going to be in the 6th degree, actually the 7th degree, because we round up from the 6th to the 7th. Whereas in the tropical system, it's happening in the very first bound, was what the Egyptians called it, of tropical Aries. And again, a lot of people say, well, the tropical astrology is not using the correct zodiacal positions. Yes, they actually are with respect to the fixed stars. They compare the fixed star groups into the tropical system, which in my opinion is the lower densest layer. This is why I've always kept in between the Vedic and the ancient traditional classical astrology, which came up again, I believe, mainly out of Egypt, Greece, and again, the Babylonian and Mesopotamian masters that had all this stuff. And boy, I'll tell you what, you got to read it before you knock it, because they were pretty sharp. And they were using the tropical system juxtaposed up against the sidereal spheres of fixed stars. And I have to say, I'm constantly casting prashnas and interrogation astrology in both sidereal, and I look at it in its respective way through prashna, and I'll look at it also in tropical, especially when I get tough ones that I can't fully, nail down the exact outcomes. I look at them both, and it gets me to the answer. So pretty interesting stuff. There's an old saying, God confused all the languages. I'm not so sure he didn't confuse all the astrologers as well. So interesting stuff. And with that, I'm going to start to close here because I've got to run here. But again, this is, kind of an overview of December. I think we're going to see some really powerful creative energies that we can all use, and everybody's going to experience it different. Some people are going to have good times or bad times, depending on all the outer transits or progressions and cycles you're going through, which is different for everybody. So with that, have a great beginning of the week here and rest of your weekend, and I will talk to you next week. Thanks so much for listening.